we have a game with a tutorial bit of level design, and I'd say just package this up and send it off to Steam and become a multi-millionaire at this point, right? Although, I kind of feel like maybe we're forgetting a important step. Oh yeah, we need to add art assets. Now, I am by no means an artist. I can get by well enough to make some assets for my games. So we're going to go through on a fairly basic level here, because that much I can definitely show you. But this by no means is an all-encompassing art tutorial. There's a couple of different things that we can do when we make 3D models for our games. Number one is making individual reusable assets. That's what we're going to be doing for the ground of our 3 islands here. They're all different sizes and they need to be a little bit adjusted, but they can largely work off of the same initial base asset that we're going to be making in Blender. Number 2 is essentially decoration, things like foliage, trees, grass, that kind of thing, where you often just have a couple of minor variations on a single model just to break up everything looking very samey, and then you just instance those all over the place a lot of different times. Number 3 is making a modular level set. And those are more like what you might do in a 2D environment, and that is making a tile set. You'll make a set for your walls, for your floors, for your ceilings. That include things like the center bits, the edge bits, a corner bit, all those types of things. And that might come in useful with things like these platforming sections. We don't really necessarily want to be making a unique asset for every single bit that we have going on here, or a unique asset for every island as a whole or whatever. What we want to do is we want to create a kit that we can use to more or less do the same thing as what you do when you're tracing an image, when you're drawing it. What we want to do is we want to use that kit to try and make this, but with actual graphics. And that is why in a previous video I told you, when you're making this, try to stick to a predetermined size for your grid, where everything fits within multiples of 500 or 1000 or maybe even 250. Because then when you make your kit, you can just make those little tile sections sized 500 by 500 units, and you know that they're going to map on more or less perfectly to what you have built. Well, I've broken that rule in a handful of different places here, and we're going to be running into that. But those are the 3 different types. And today we're getting started with making the ground for our islands. So we're going to make a singular asset that we're going to import and just put in a couple of different places so that we have something to walk on. Now, we're here in Blender, and it's quite important in this case that you actually work with roughly the sizes and proportions that you're going to be using in Engine. Which for a box brush, you can come down in here in its details panel, and at some point you're going to run into these brush settings, and you can create a static mesh out of it. Static mesh is going to be put somewhere in some folder. In this case, I think it's just going to put it in the content folder. You have your static mesh. If you open that up, we can check if that's a proper static mesh. It is. And we can right click on it in the content browser, go into asset actions, and we can export it. I'm going to export this into my assets folder that is part of the project download as well. And I'm going to put this in a new folder called World Meshes or something along those lines. And this is going to be our basic island size box. Just give it whatever name you want to give it. We can save that, and now it exports that as an FBX file. Wonderful thing is, if we go into Blender and we just delete everything about this, we can go File, Import FBX, go to that same directory where we saved it, and we can import the FBX. And now we've got the exact same size because it is the exact same mesh that we can start working off of. You will see that the geometry for it is not that workable because it's triangles. Game engines tend to turn things into triangles because that's easier and just more standard to render things in triangles. Whereas working on things, we generally do that in quads, in rectangles and squares, because it makes it easier to actually work with the geometry. So we're not going to be necessarily working with this right away. What we're going to do is we're going to make a mesh, just add a new cube, And we're going to make that cube the exact same size instead, or at least roughly the same size. We can check how big this thing actually is if we just click on it. And we go into this little arrow icon here, opens up a little menu, and we see it's 30 by 30 meters. If you want these dimensions to match exactly the numbers that you see in Unreal Engine as well, because this actually matches up with what we did in Unreal. In Unreal Engine, this thing is 3000 by 3000 units. As we can see, if we just Control Z this back into a brush, 3K by 3K. These are centimeters, these are simply meters. That maps one-to-one to each other. If you want these to also display in centimeters, you can come up into the Scene tab here, and then go into your units. By default, the unit system is set to metric, and the length is displayed in meters. We can just change that to centimeters, and the entire system now uses the same unit. So that's kind of nice. Anyway, we know that this thing is 3000 by 3000 centimeters. So we go into the cube, we can just say, hey, we want you to be 3000 by 3000 as well. Now with that, we can either delete, or in this case, I'm just going to hide the original brush mesh. And there's one thing that we need to make sure to do, and that is before we start editing anything, changing these dimension numbers that we have here actually scales it up. You can see that the scale is 15 by 15 by 1, because we've increased the size quite a lot. And we're going to be working a lot with modifiers here, bevel modifiers, subdivision modifiers, and there's a few modifiers, actually a decent amount of modifiers in Blender, that apply themselves before any scale transformation has happened. Which is to say, when I add in a modifier, it actually adds in a modifier as if the model still looks like this, which we don't want. We want to apply the modifiers on a model that looks like this. So we need to tell it actually the way that it looks now, this is going to be the base scale 111. And the way that we do that is we just select our mesh here and we press Ctrl and A, and then we just say, hey, we can apply its location, its rotation, its scale, and that effectively says, hey, everything that we have added here as transformation to the initial mesh, this is going to be its default state. So in this case, we want to do that with the scale, and we can see that the mesh doesn't change, but the scale now acts as if this is the default 111. I'm just going to Ctrl Z that real quick. I'm going to show you the difference when adding something like a bevel modifier. If I bevel this now, you will see that it bevels quite a bit inward, but not that much downward. Let me just add a couple more segments here so you can really see that difference, right? The bevel is effectively getting stretched inward while it's not applying that much downward, which isn't exactly the way that we want that to work. If I now apply this scale, you can see that the bevel instantly works differently. It is actually the same size in this direction that it is in this direction, because the bevel modifier gets applied before any transforming happens to the object as a whole. And speaking of bevel modifiers, we're actually going to stick with this bevel modifier a little bit, because generally it's nice to just have things a little bit beveled. Having them just super sharp doesn't look good. This instantly looks a lot better. What doesn't look very good though is the fact that we're trying to make like a floating island in the sky and it's still a square. We don't really want that to still be square, do we? Well, first and foremost, let's give this a little bit of extra shape. And we're going to only be worrying about the top of it. We're going to have two separate sections to this. We're going to have the top, which is going to be a grassy layer, and then a rocky underside. Right now, we're only worrying about the grassy top. So if we go into edit mode by pressing the tab key, or coming up here into this menu, going into edit mode, you will see that because we are working with these modifiers, when we go into edit mode, we still have the original, much simpler mesh to work with, which is actually really quite nice. That's what we want. We want the edit mode to be as simple as possible so that we can easily influence the geometry, and then the modifiers will actually make it look the way that we want it to look. A little bit more polished, a little bit more beveled in this case. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to be adding a little bit of extrusion to some of these sides to break up the very square feeling that we have going on here. So let's press Ctrl and R to add a couple of loop cuts. Use the mouse wheel to increase or decrease the amount of loop cuts. We press the left mouse button to actually apply them, and then we can slide them back and forth to where we want these to be. If you just want them to be in the middle, you press the right mouse button. but actually no, I wanted to have them somewhere else. So you can press G and G, and that lets you slide these edges along anyway. So I'm going to put one right over here, and then I want this loop that we have here to also be a little bit more toward this area over here. So I make sure that I'm in edge select mode. Just up here, you can also switch between vertices, edges, and faces with 1, 2, and 3 on your keyboard. We're going to go into edge select mode though. Holding down the Alt key and pressing on an edge will select the entire edge loop. And that is where we come back to the whole, we're working here with squares because these squares allow us to make edge flow, which works for both edges and faces as a whole. If I click on this edge over here, it can actually recognize, okay, I'm connected to this face, which is connected to this face, which is connected to this face, which is connected to this face. So pressing Alt and clicking on this edge, it selects that entire loop. However, holding Alt and pressing on this edge, it will do the same thing with this loop. And being able to select these loops is nice for just workflow reasons. But again, also a lot of the actual modifiers, like the bevel modifier, rely on your model being able to recognize these loops of geometry. If you start introducing things like triangles, or God forbid, even polygons with more than 4 sides, those can be fine in between different edge loops, but they will terminate an edge loop if you run into it. So, as an example, you can press K for the knife tool, and if I just make this little square here into 2 triangles by just cutting it up, you will see that now I can no longer properly select this edge loop because it runs into these triangles and it cannot resolve those. And you might have also noticed when I did that, something changed a little bit about the beveling here, because the bevel modifier also no longer recognizes this as part of a loop, so it can't really do anything with it. All that said, we're going to go into edge select mode and press Alt to select this edge, GG, to slide it along the existing geometry, and just create a bit of an area here that we can start extruding with. So we'll go into face select mode with 3, select this face, press E to extrude, and that'll just let you create some new geometry here that we can work with. And again, because we're working entirely with squares, our edge loop selection still works. It just uses that new geometry, and it even can recognize the loop going around this corner, right? If I press this edge over here, holding down Alt, it properly recognizes this still as a loop. Now, I of course want this to be tapering off a little bit, because these are going to be kind of just, they'll outshoot little distortions to the way that this island is going to look. So I want this to kind of taper off a little bit. You can press S to scale, and if you just scale this down, it will also start scaling it down in the height direction. So it's going to be kind of sloping off. We don't really want that in this case, so we want to scale with S, and then press Shift and Z. So it's going to scale it in every axis except for the Z. So it's just going to scale it down in the X and the Y in this case. And I'm going to make just a handful of more edge loops here. I'm going to do a different method here. I'm going to just add edge loops, 2 of them, slide them down, and then I can scale these in specifically the X-axis, and that also makes them either go closer apart or further apart. We're working with the X-axis here because the X-axis is this red line that goes through the world. If I were to add in edge loops here, the way that I would scale them would not be the X-axis, of course, it would then be the Y-axis instead. Generally, what I prefer doing is just making the amount of edge loops that I want, then left-clicking, then sliding them over to where I want them to be. That is here. Then left-clicking again, that actually applies them, and then personally, what I like to do is just select one of the edges and slide it to be where I want it to be instead. Then we'll extrude this out as well. We'll scale it, Shift-C to only scale it in the X and the Y directions. And then we'll probably do one right around here as well. Again, scale it down a little bit. And this doesn't still look like very much of an island, and I would agree with you there. But we're going to get there. So let's keep just doing this a little bit. And this honestly isn't looking all that fancy. We're going to round this out and we're going to manipulate this a little bit more. And we can do that in a handful of different ways. Number one is adding a subdivision surface modifier. That adds in extra geometry. Effectively, every face on your model is going to get split up into 4 different faces. So it will dramatically increase the poly count of your model. But what it will also do is where it does that, it smooths out any of the sharper edges. So if we turn off the bevel modifier here, we can see that everywhere it has an edge, because the extra face that's being added between these 2 faces that exist, it's averaging out how they are positioned and rotated, so that it adds this nice smoothness to it. And instantly that creates much more of this like blobby kind of feel that we are looking for. There's also the matter of, do we apply this before or after the bevel that we made? Because that matters. The order of operations here matters. If I do the subdivision surface first, it's first going to make it blobby, and then it's going to be applying the bevel. Whereas if we apply the bevel first, it has much more geometry on those edges, so the edges themselves don't get deformed as much. I actually like the way that it looks when we do this, because we're trying to get a little bit more of a round feeling to the entire thing, right? And that is what this can do for us. Matter of fact, the bevel itself doesn't actually do that much anymore at this point, because the roundness mostly comes from the subdivision surface. I can turn on and off the preview for it here, and you can see that, yeah, this outer edge is getting beveled quite a bit still. So if you like that look, you might want to keep it. I'm actually going to remove it for the time being, because with the low poly style that I like, that we're trying to go for here, I'm going to kind of handle that a little differently. We might add it in back later, but for now, we're going to stick with the way that we have it. Now, since this is going to be the top layer of grass that we're going to be kind of overlaying over a floating boulder, what I want to have happen from a profile view is more or less, let's say that this is the side view of our floating island, right? Then our grass should probably kind of like wrap around the top edge that we have here. Kind of like, I'm very bad at drawing, kind of like this. And all this will like be grass as well on the side. That's kind of what it's doing with this little slope that we have here. But what I prefer to do is, in this case, I'm just going to be selecting everything with the faces at the top. You can select just multiple things like you would be used to in things like Windows, holding down Shift and just selecting more grows your selection. If we just scale this up a little bit, that makes the entire thing taper inwards, and that's kind of a look that I think I like quite a lot. You can of course increase the amount of subdivisions. Every single one of these is going to exponentially add more geometry, so yes, it's going to smooth it out even more, but we have a lot of geometry going on here. So I'm going to stick with just one subdivision for now. I might add a second level later. The wonderful thing about the modifier workflow here is that it is entirely procedural, so we don't need to make a definitive decision for what level of subdivision we want to work with quite yet. Now, I want to be able to just pull around a bit of this geometry more than I have right now. And we can do that by just going into edit mode and selecting, for instance, with one vertex mode, and then selecting this vertex and then just moving it around, or selecting this vertex and moving it around. But that is, number one, kind of hard to control, and it's also just a bad way to get used to doing it, because Blender has built-in features for deforming things that work a little bit better. So what we're going to do is we're going to Shift A to add a new object, and then we add in a lattice instead. So we can either say just add in a lattice, or if we have something selected, we can say lattice deform selected. And that adds in a lattice, which is just a bounding box with the size of whatever objects we currently have selected, which is quite nice. And it automatically adds in a lattice modifier to that object that will say, hey, deform along with this lattice. So what is a lattice? It's just a bounding box that allows us to deform stuff. For that, we need a bit more resolution though. So with the lattice selected, we have this little green data icon here, and that gives us a resolution. If we have a resolution of 2, that means it has 2 points, so 1, 2 in each direction. Let's set this to something like 4 in each direction. Well, we don't need 4 in the up and down direction, so that would just be 2 still. And now we can go tab over into edit mode with the lattice selected, and we have way fewer points that will way more easily let us manipulate the size and shape of this island. We can even take these outer points and pull them out a little bit. And just like this, we can manipulate this island so much more easily than with individual vertices on the model itself. And again, because we're now deforming this through a modifier, what we can do is go back into object mode and select this. We can turn it off and the deformation doesn't happen anymore. We can just remove it and our original geometry is still there. Matter of fact, if we go into edit mode and we turn off the lattice visually because it's a little noisy, we can see that our geometry is still super simple. So if I now want to say, actually, I want to add in like an extrusion here. I don't, but let's just pretend like I do for a moment. Turn on back the lattice modifier here. And you can see that that's just also getting deformed with the lattice because everything is being applied procedurally. That said, I don't want that extrusion there, actually. So let's just kind of keep at it this way. Taking a real quick break here to say, if you're enjoying this or finding this helpful, a way that is entirely free for you to support me, if you don't want to sign up for the Patreon, is to go down below in the description to my Steam page for my own game and add it to your wishlist. Only takes a couple of seconds to do, but it actually does massively help me out and support me making my game and the content that comes along with it. Now we have another issue that I would personally like to improve on, and that is I want the edges to be a little bit more sharp still, because they are tapering off down and then they're tapering off in this direction. I don't really like that. I want them to be a little bit sharper in the way that they taper off. So how can we do that? Well, there's a couple of ways that we can do that. Some of them are useful sometimes and get in the way other times and the other way around. Because the subdivision surface modifier that we're using averages out any new faces between any edge and its next edge, right? That's what it's doing with this geometry that we've seen here. If you just add in an edge closer to, well, the current outer edge, it's going to add in all the new faces between those super close edges, which means it's going to taper off less. It's going to be sharper. So we can add in a loop cut. We want to do that on the cube itself, not on the lattice. So in edit mode, we can add in that loop cut. And if we just pull that close to the edge, you will see that this edge now becomes a lot sharper. And we can do that with every single one of these edges. Now, the issue is that we start getting into like this type of deal where we need to start adding in quite a few loop cuts to really get the shape of everything in order. And it also then goes back in and reintroduces the like blockiness of everything. So in this case, actually, that's not really what I want to do. All I want to do is just say, hey, this outer edge, selecting edge select with 2 and an alt select and holding down shift alongside it, will allow me to select all the other outer edges, which right now it's kind of having a difficult time selecting everything. But we have the entire upper edge selected. What we can do is we can say, hey, we want to crease this. And creasing pretty much just tells the subdivision surface modifier, I want this edge to remain sharp or sharper. There's just a 0 to 1 value. So we can make this say, I want this to just be about like 50% sharp when we get subdivided. And that keeps the outer edges a little bit more sharp without actually making things overly blocky again. And now that we have that in place, we can start experimenting with maybe one more subdivision. That pretty much sounds good. And then maybe we want to actually pull down the creasiness a little bit. So we have still a little bit of tapering off here, but not too much. And it's just a little bit of trial and error that we work with here. But with all that, we now have what's essentially the grassy upside of our little island. I'm going to give this a temporary material. So just come down here into the material section, just make a new material, call it something like grass. And we're just going to make that a green color. You won't see it in this view because this is the solid view mode. It doesn't show materials. You can model in viewport shading. That gives you previews for materials without actually being expensive to render. Sometimes that makes it easier to distinguish certain parts of a mesh from each other and have context as to what it is supposed to be. But now that we have this, we're going to be filling this up with a lot more stuff in engine eventually, as with like decoration and foliage type stuff. But we need to add in the rocky undersides. For that, I am personally going to just be adding in another new mesh. So Shift A to get this menu, let's just add in a cube. and I'm going to G to move, Shift Z to only move it in the X and Y axis. And we're going to kind of just go over into edit mode, scale this thing up a little. And more or less, all that we're going to do is just move this down, scale it down a little, move it down a bit more, and place down a handful of these that we're going to be adjusting slightly. Probably want to add in a subdivision surface modifier for this one as well. And here we can see, yeah, okay. So this definitely shows you the smoothness that a subdivision surface modifier adds. And here we can either say, okay, we want to once again just get this top set of edges, maybe even turn off this top cube that we had there. Just go into face select mode so we can easily select the whole face. And then if you go back into edge select mode, it will just select the edges of that face that you had selected, which is quite nice. Here it might make a little bit more sense to use this creasing method because it saves us from having to add more unnecessary extra geometry. Not that it is that important, but still. And that way we can start adding some more detail to all this. So that's kind of nice. I'm going to pull this one down a little bit and maybe even like over slightly. And we still want to be adding a bit of detailing in some geometry, right? We can, for instance, add in this loop cut here, scale it down a little bit, and then this loop cuts. Loop cuts don't always work on the top and bottom sections, which is annoying. I scale this down a little bit more, maybe move it over a little, just to add a tiny bit of extra distortion to this area. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this face, still in face select mode, holding down Control, going all the way down to this face, the bottom one down here, is going to try to find the shortest path between the two faces that I'm selecting between and select everything in that path. So I'm going to just pull this out a little bit and then do the same thing here. Pull this out a little bit more. And here we come down to just kind of messing around until you find something that kind of feels good. The way that I'm going to be doing this is I'm going to start with all of these little offshoots that I've made. And I'm more or less just filling out what makes sense to them as far as having something that is actually like a substantial amount of ground. These little offshoots would have what essentially would amount to a massive kind of stalactite hanging above them, most likely. So we make those. And it's good to just keep rotating around your objects because we're making a 3D model here, right? And we're doing that on a 2D screen. So we're always going to have some sort of limitation as to what we can see at any given time because we can only see one perspective. If you're modeling in VR, you actually have a little bit of a better grasp on this, but still then you would be moving your head left and right to be able to properly judge how things look at different angles. So while you're modeling, do make sure that you're constantly trying to figure out, okay, does it look good from only this angle or does it actually look good? Going to be adding a loop cut in here as well so that we can maybe move these things over a little bit more like this. And then these two I do want to kind of scale down, maybe move them down a little bit as well. And up here, we've got some stuff that we want to maybe move in a bit more. And that'll be the first of our little ground areas, let's call them. So let's make a new material for this as well. And we'll call this just rock. And I'll make that something like a brown color, maybe. And we can start from scratch, just add in a new cube and keep doing that. Or we can just Shift D to duplicate. And then automatically it'll go into moving mode. So we can do Shift Z to lock it to the X and Y axis, put it roughly in place of the next thing where we want to be. R to rotate, Z to lock the rotation to the Z axis, and then just rotate it around a little bit, move it into place so that it is roughly where we want it to be. We can press numpad 7 to go into top view mode. And if we then enable our viewport shading to wireframe, we can much more easily see through it all. To place this more or less in the proper location, we can go back into our just material preview shading, and then in edit mode, just move this around a little bit more so that it fits this particular little section. And maybe we want this one to taper off a little bit more narrow so that it looks a bit more unique as well, which might be nice. And slowly but surely, we're getting somewhere. So we'll do at least 2 more of those little things. One for this area and one for this area, I think. So again, we're going to just work over this original one. Shift D, Shift Z, rotate in the Z. You can actually type in the amount of rotation that you want. In this case, I actually just wanted to rotate 180 degrees. So just type in 180 and it just rotates it 180 degrees. Can be quite as simple as that, really. I'm going to go into top view mode with numpad 7. Go into wireframe mode to place this thing down, at least roughly. Back into viewport shading, into edit mode, and we adjust everything about this the way that we want it to. Sometimes tabbing over into vertex mode with 1 to just displace specific vertexes or vertices. Sometimes maybe you want to just slide an edge a little bit down, like this. Again, with an edge selected, press G and then G again. Let you slide it across the face that it exists on, which can help smooth things out in one direction or another. A bit like this. And this edge down here, for instance, might be a little difficult to select sometimes, but here we run into the fact that we are orbiting with our middle mouse button around the center of our scene, but I actually want to be orbiting around what I have here. So if you press numpad period, we zoom in on whatever we have selected, and the median point of whatever we have selected will become our new orbiting point, which is super useful. So now we can select this edge, we can zoom out back again and just kind of slide this up as well. And we still are orbiting around that point. Honestly, I kind of like the way that this is progressing so far. Just Shift D, Shift Z, kind of move it into place. Numpad 7, wireframe mode, Control, rotate with R, lock it to the Z axis, kind of move it into place. Back into viewport shading, just make minor adjustments. A little bit of just visual difference goes a long way. And you see, for these ones, I'm not adding a lattice because these are so low poly and I want to make fairly like micro adjustments. As micro as you get with this low poly style, of course. That I don't really think adding a lattice for this makes that much sense, but you still could add a lattice, especially if you have more geometry going on here and you want just fewer, more broad interpolated like edit points for your deformation. Could still be doing all this with a lattice. Now, we're not quite there yet because now we need to fill up the center area. And the way that I'm going to be filling up the center area is honestly just kind of quite similar. We just duplicate this thing over. We move it a little bit more to the center and I just scale it up a fair amount. You might see that it starts clipping through the top of our island. So just move it down a little bit. And we just add like 1 or 2 of these bigger ones and we'll edit these. Turn some of these older ones off, maybe as well. But we'll edit these to be a little bit more just like straightforward going down, a little bit less curved and all that kind of stuff. But we still want these definitely to be somewhat overlapping with the ones that we've already placed in. Again, a lot of what we're doing here also is just, it depends on specifically the style that we want to go for. Let's make sure that we're not overlapping with everything too much. So maybe you don't visually like the way that these things clip through each other, which is entirely fair, by the way. And you might want to work a little bit more like this, where they don't as obviously clip through each other, which actually is probably a pretty good idea, to be honest with you, because I like the way this looks a little bit better. And then we select everything down here. If you try to box select, by the way, and you don't select everything in the back, you can turn on X-ray mode, and that should allow you to select things in the back as well. And with that, I can move this just a little bit more down, move this in a little bit, move this in a little bit, just to make it a bit more just straight down. You know. Then we duplicate this again, move it over, rotate it some amount. Now, the rotation here is kind of messed up because the pivot point is this little orange point, and that is very much not in the middle. We can fix that in one of 2 different ways. We can either go into edit mode, just select everything and kind of eyeball move this into place with G and then Shift Z, and then we can kind of, this is roughly the middle-ish. With Shift 7, you can see it a little bit better, but then the pivot point becomes hard to see sometimes. So This can be annoying. Another way is to right-click in object mode, set origin, and we can set the origin to the geometry. And that'll set the origin of our mesh, the pivot point that we also like rotate around, right, to the exact average position of all the vertices in our model. Now that's going to also make it move down a little bit. That's maybe what we want, maybe what we don't want, but from here it is much easier to go into edit mode and just move our mesh so that it's a little bit closer to the top. And now if we rotate along the Z, it actually rotates in a way that kind of makes a bit more sense. So let's use that, go into wireframe mode again, and just put this, rotate it around. Again, make sure that you rotate exactly in the Z, not on all three axes. And we can put this down somewhere, move it up a little bit, maybe scale this one down ever so slightly. And then at this point, things are becoming a little visually messy because things are clipping through each other, makes it hard to really work with, which is again where things like X-ray mode can come in because you can see the entire wireframe that we're working with, or just going into viewport shading and setting it to wireframe mode, because then, well, we only see the wireframe of everything. But with a lot of objects, that still can become kind of visually noisy. So this X-ray mode is a pretty neat, like, middle ground alternative for that. So we select this and we can just kind of move this around in a way where it fills up a little bit more space in some areas, because we want this to feel like a proper section of this floating island. And then maybe just move this up a little bit. And these now kind of seem curved into the same direction, which I don't love. So I'm actually going to curve this around a little bit more, or rotate it around so that they don't feel too much like they're the same object in different scales, even though largely they are. And then I want to add in one more of them in the center here. So we duplicate again with Shift D, then we move it a little bit over, we rotate it a little bit. And this one I want to scale in the X and Y axis again. So we scale with Shift Z, just make it a little bit more shallow. And then we scale this in just a Z by scaling and then pressing Z without Shift. And it scales it away and toward the pivot point as well. So because the pivot point here is at the very top, we can very easily just make this thing be a fair bit longer. Having good pivot points really does help quite a lot. Now I think I might have overdone it a little bit with this one, to be honest. So let's just pull this one back a bit, and that'll be the base of our floating island. Is this perfect? No, it's not. There's definitely a lot better artists out there that could do a better job at this, but this is basically an easy way to get started by just putting some objects together and making something that is halfway decent to look at. If you click on an object in Blender, you can just set it to shading as smooth, and that averages out all those sharp corners by just shading. There's no extra geometry added here. This is just a method that is getting shaded as. And actually, when we import this into Unreal, by default, it will recalculate the normals, which is to say how every single one of these faces gets shaded. So shading smooth is actually closer to the way that this is going to be looking in Unreal. So let's select everything, shade it as smooth. Some of the edges might seem a little weird, and that is because shading everything smooth kind of messes up things that are very sharp edges. So we can say shade auto smooth, and that only shades the edges that are more or less sharp than a certain angle, and that automatically applies a modifier, in this case it's being 30 degrees. All right, this is going to be basically what we're going to be working with here. You can add in a bit more like definition by maybe selecting an edge or two and then beveling that edge, and then maybe selecting some of these edges that you have beveled. Maybe not this bottom one though, and increasing the crease for them so that they end up being a little bit more sharp again, which is nice because I do want to have certain amounts of sharpness in this model. So again, I bevel this and I say, hey, that's the wrong edge. So let's turn off X-ray mode because I want to make sure that I'm selecting the proper edges here. I just kind of messed up there with one of them. I select this edge. I say I want to bevel this edge, and then just select this edge, select this edge as well. Again, the way that I'm doing this, selecting the bottom one, holding down Control, gets shortest path, and holding down Shift, I select a new active edge, holding down Control, it gets the shortest path. And then I just increase the creasing for this. Just adds a little bit more sharpness to some of these edges. And now I can just say, okay, I want to slide this edge over, and I want to slide this edge over, and I can start slowly adding in that like more blocky definition that we're looking for, while still having the thing as a whole be relatively smooth and just kind of nicer to look at. And I'm going to call that our, at least for right now, more or less finished island. So let's take everything we have here and compare it first and foremost to our initial imported thing. It has become quite a lot bigger at this point, and that might be fine, or that might be kind of annoying. So let's select everything and just kind of scale it down in the X and Y until it is more or less matching a bit better with the initial size that we had. Of course, some things are going to be a little bit smaller, some things are going to be a fair bit bigger. The point of this was to not make it a square, so of course it's not gonna be a square anymore, it's not gonna fit one-to-one. But for the most part, just check if you haven't made this way too big, or if you haven't put things in way too much to make it way too small. Just make sure that it kind of more or less fits with the initial size. Then we can make it invisible again. And make sure that we save our project, because we're going to be exporting this now. We can export this in File, Export. You can export this as a whole bunch of different things. I'm going to be exporting it as an FBX file, but you should be able to also get away with an STL file or an object file. FBX is what I'm most used to using, though. So make sure that it's in the right directory. I've already made an export here just to check it out, but I forgot to do one thing, and that is, in this case, I only want to export the visible objects. We still have this static mesh as a reference in the project, and we don't want to export that out either. We only want to export the things that we made. So we export the visible objects only, and in here you also have in geometry, make sure that you're applying the modifiers, because everything that we have done is entirely procedural through those modifiers. You can actually export these without the modifiers as well if you wanted to, just getting the super low poly version of it. But we want to make sure that we export with modifiers. So export that FBX and then open up Unreal again. And in Unreal, we just open up our content browser and put this into, I don't know, do we have like level props? I'm going to put it in level props maybe. New folder, islands, let's call it that. Something very badly named, to be honest with you. And just drag in our exported FBX. Now here, do pay attention, because if we just import this right away now, it's going to import all those separate static meshes as well, separate static meshes, which, I mean, could be useful in terms of us trying to like put together more like modular sets of islands. So there's definitely something to the idea of importing them separately. I, at the moment, don't want to import them separately, though. So let's delete everything we had there, drag it back in again, and scroll down a little bit. We've got a bunch of settings here about recomputing the normals, and that's all that stuff that I talked about before. Unreal, by default, recomputes the normals for your mesh to kind of smooth out the harsher edges. If we scroll down even more, though, we can tell it to combine the static meshes. This will take all of these separate meshes that we had and just import it as a singular mesh that we can pull into our world, and there we go. It also imported the two very basic material instances here, because it is in a super easy, like, it's just a color, right? So it's quite easily able to just interpret that with a built-in FBX, like, interpreter material. That'll do for the time being. That'll be good enough. And then all we really need to do is put this into position. So we make sure that it's roughly at the same Z height as our actual island thing is. Then we move it into a position where we like the way that things look. Maybe rotate it around until we're happy with the way that things are lined up. In this case, I actually think that it's kind of nice if our floating little platform gets us to this little area down here. And, well, this more or less does what it needs to do. So we can get rid of this box brush, and we now have an island. I actually think that we ended up making this thing a little, I have snapping on in Unreal as well, a little smaller than maybe even we would want. So we can just increase the size of the island as a whole here. And we might need to adjust some things now that there's an actual mesh in place. There's one thing that I want to get at before we do any of that though, because if we go over here, we'll see that the collision might not be mega intuitive, because the collision is actually pretty decent for what it is right now. It's done a pretty good job, I would say, interpreting the collision, but I still want to show you the collision related stuff. So if we open up this island static mesh, we can look at its collision, and it probably just auto-created a convex hull collision. And we can check that in here in the little eyeball drop-down menu. We can check its simple collision and its complex collision. Its complex collision is essentially just its geometry. Oftentimes, this is way more high poly than you need a collider to be. In this case, our mesh itself is fairly low poly, so it really isn't that high poly to be used as a collider. So we could use this just one-to-one as the collider. But if you're going to be importing things with, instead of only about 2,500 triangles, you're importing things with 20,000, 200,000 triangles. That's not entirely unreasonable in some cases for assets. You don't want that detailed of a collision because your CPU is going to hate you for that. So we have simplified versions of a shape for actual colliders. Unreal, when you import a mesh, will try to just kind of make a shrink-wrapped, very rough shape around that mesh to work as a collider. And you can actually see it did a pretty good job here, but it still is a little rough. This might be a little too low poly for what we want it to be. So what we can do is we can tell it to use a specific other mesh that we can make as the collider. And for that, what I will do is I will go back into Blender here, and I'm going to make this into two separate collections. This is the first collection that we have here. That's just existing by default. So I just collapse that and I make a new collection. I can pretty much just copy everything over into said new collection, then disable the old one. And we're going to be making this just lower poly. So if we select these meshes here and I want to just not have the subdivision, so we can just delete the subdivision from all these. This is going to be the lower poly version of this mesh. It's going to have a pretty significant amount less in terms of geometry. And this is going to be the low poly version of it, which in some regards, you might actually like the look of the even more blocky thing that we have going on here. It's entirely up to your own personal preference, of course, but just adjust this a little bit so that we don't have an area that we can walk onto sticking out all ugly like that. So after we've cleaned up a little bit there, it's not an exact match. It's just, again, we're going to be using this as a collider. So if it looks a little messy, that's not really a problem. But just any things that are maybe sticking out too much, pull them back in because that might be a bit weird to play with. But now we have a low poly version of this thing, which is, again, when we import this into Unreal, you will see it's actually pretty significantly lower poly. And that's generally better for things like colliders. So we can export this as well. Make sure that we call this something like low poly or collider or whatever. And here we can, instead of just exporting the visible objects like we did before, since we now have separate collections, one for the high poly one and a collection 2 for the low poly one, we can say we only want to export the active collection as well. That'll make sure that since this thing is set to not being active, you can see it's turned off. It won't export that one, only the one, everything in collection 2. So export that FBX. Then we can import this low poly. It should still remember our settings from before where we say, hey, import everything as a combined mesh. Right here, combined static meshes, so that's good. And it imports this as the lower poly version. If we check how many polys we have here, this is only 500 triangles, so it's much lower poly. It's also probably too low poly to actually put in the world. Like, just look at what this looks like. It's a blocky mess and it's kind of ugly. It also doesn't really need the materials because we're never going to be rendering this. There's not something to display. What we do is we use this mesh and we can just type in mesh into the details here. And we can say the complex collision mesh that we're going to be using will be this low poly mesh. If you have it selected in your content browser, you can just use this little arrow icon and tell it to use this. This is now what it's going to be using for the complex collision. For some reason, overriding your collider overrides the complex collision and not the simple collision. So if you still want the option to have the collider be like the exact mesh, this is going to take that away from you. But for the most part, you probably don't need that to. But do make sure that if you do this, you also look up complex in the settings, because you'll need to set your collision complexity from project default to use complex as simple. And that's going to then show us the, well, simple collision here will be this mesh asset that we put in. You might need to tweak things a little bit because it might be a bit too easy to stand on like midair with this. But as you can see, our collider here sticks out a bit too much, and it's going to be sticking out a bit too much here as well. So there's definitely a bit of tweaking involved if you're going to be doing this. And for something that you're like actually walking onto, I would argue that just using the more complex collision itself is honestly just fine, especially with this thing being fairly low poly. That's going to give, in the end, the best results. But if you have something like a detailed mesh for a piece of wall or a gate that you need to be able to walk through or whatever, the convex hull collision might be a little janky with all that, but the actual complex collision mesh might be way too high detail to actually use for colliders. So that's where things like that can come in a little bit more handy than we have here. For what we have right now, I would argue that probably the normal complex collision is more than fine. So yeah, from here, we just copy this over and place it in here as well. Now, you're going to immediately run into the issue that, but we make this thing and it doesn't really fit the like level design that we made for island number 2 here. And you would be correct. Number 1, the size of island number 2 is bigger, so we just need this thing to, number 1, generally be a larger object. So we can just scale it up, that's fine. And I rotate it around a little bit in this case because I want the river to be running through here. I think that makes the most sense. So let's try and do that a bit. But how are we going to accomplish this whole river thing now? Because there needs to be a bit of a dent here to make the river make sense in any way, shape, or form. Well, let's remove the box brush that we have here, and then we need to start editing this mesh to conform a little bit more to the actual level design that we've made. We go into modeling mode for that, and we can make a duplicate of this mesh so that we're not editing the original mesh that's also going to be influencing this actor over here by going into Xform and just clicking on duplicate. This makes a separate second mesh that's just a copy of the first mesh. If I now re-import this one, it's not going to reflect any changes in here either. So if you're making a mesh that you think that you're going to be tweaking at a later date, this essentially decouples them from each other. These two are not related in any way, shape, or form anymore at all. But the upside of that is that I can go into Deform, Vertex Sculpt, and I can say, just pull some of these vertices down a little bit, and we have, more or less, our river. It's a little rough, I will be honest. And that's partly because this is just a little low poly to be sculpting on and sculpting with, but Unreal's a little lacking sometimes in some of these modeling tools. They're still relatively new, kind of. But you can definitely see that if you have this being very low poly, it starts being a bit of an issue. And you might just need to mess about with all this a little bit to get all the vertices in places where you need them to be, with this all being so ridiculously low poly. Sculpting kind of gets in the way, so making it a bit more high poly might help, just making this process a little bit less annoying, to be honest with you. But after a bit of work, you're gonna get there eventually, hopefully. At least it seems like I'm getting close enough at this point. If you really find yourself running into trouble with things being too low poly, you can always use dynamic sculpting, because this actually adds like remeshing as well. So let's make this brush size a little smaller as well. I don't like the way that the brush size preview looks for this, because you don't see what the hell you're doing. I don't know who thought this was a good brush size preview for sculpting. It's kind of idiotic. So your mileage may vary a little bit with all that. So just be wary of that. Might also just need to come back in here and change up our little river in polygroup editing mode by just making this a little bit wider as well. And that also immediately fixes some of the issues quite easily and quite handily as well. So just adjust this a little bit until it feels a bit better. Maybe you want to bevel this edge a little bit. All this stuff is up to whatever you want to do with it. We're going to be replacing this when we actually start making a proper material for it at some point anyway. So now we play from here and we can just double jump. I think this is supposed to be dashing actually. We can just dash over this and we've got something going for us there. And then copy this one over to here one more final time because we need to do the same thing just with a bigger gap for this area over here as well. So we rotate this, we move it back a little until we have something kind of in the same area. Make sure it's about at the proper height as well. Seems like I don't even have a kill volume for this area yet, so maybe adding in a kill volume and like a little bit of water here, all that kind of stuff would also be good. But you can probably do that as a bit of homework because it's everything that we've done already before. Just do it over and over again. And to fill out our sky a little bit more, what we can also do is just take some more of these and just kind of scatter them about around in the sky. Makes the world feel a little bit more filled up, a little bit more populated. And since we're going to be seeing these mostly only from like one angle, just even rotate them a bit if you want to be like super fancy about it. Rotating these things around, at least like the z-axis, makes them seem a lot more unique than they might actually be. And then if you scale these ones down a little bit as well, right? The same asset can start looking fairly different if you just deform them a little bit, which saves you having to make these decorative islands that don't actually serve any use aside from being something somewhat visual. You can just use the same asset for them. Of course, it has its limits. This one might be a little too stretched and squashed out, but if we just play through now, you can see it feels a lot more like there's a bunch of islands floating around here and we're just going over a handful of them instead of just 3 islands and the rest of this world is just a void. And the more you even place in even further away parts and you start populating these with some art assets as well, the more filled out this entire thing is eventually going to feel. Now, as one last final little thing, I also am just going to be using this island as the thing that we use to go from platform to platform. Of course, it's going to need to be a whole bunch smaller. And you probably would want this to just be a unique asset. But for now, we're just going to kind of go with this. So I'm going to copy over this transform by shift right-clicking on the transform text here. That's going to copy over the transform as a whole, because that way we can easily just say, hey, use this as an island, shift left click to paste that transform, and it's going to paste the actual world transform as well. So that's my bad. What we want to do is we want to shift right click the scale only and only paste the scale. That makes a bit more sense. And then, I don't know, rotate this around to a way that it kind of feels a bit more friendly. And then the same for this, paste the scale, use the proper mesh, and you might need to go into a lot of these level sequences now to just make sure that number one, their scale keyframes are removed because they will be set to scale 1. And their location keyframes might need to be updated because you might have needed to move them up or down or left or right a little bit. So just go through and make sure that the scale keyframes and the location keyframes everywhere make sense for where they should be. And these also maybe just need to be changed a little bit because otherwise they're clipping through places and it's just a little bit of extra tweaking needed. Some of these collider boxes then also might need to be moved, and there's just a bit of extra work to all of this, which between this video and the next one, I implore you to just go through and kind of play around with tweaking the things that we've done. This one probably also we can switch out to being a island, so we can just put an island here instead, make it a little bit smaller and just again, rotate this around, put this there, maybe make it go down a little bit more, delete this brush. Suddenly, we're starting on an island, and slowly but surely, this is turning from a world of grey boxes into at least a world, you see, this one just kind of snaps to its full scale, but at least it's a world of something that resembles actual, like, game art. Once again, by no means am I a super skilled artist, which is partly the reason that I'm going through and making it like this very solid color, low poly style, because it's the thing that I can show you how to make, and it's also something that's going to be the easiest for you, most likely, to be making if you're still new to this entire process as well. Next time, I think we're going to use all these skills that we have built up, and we're going to be making a couple of trees, maybe a little bit of grass, that we can then start scattering about on these islands to give them a little bit more uniqueness and a little bit more personality to start working with. And a very big thank you to all my Patreons. You can see them on screen right now. If you want to help support the channel or get any of the project files in any of my tutorials, there's a link down below to the Patreon page to support me, or alternatively as a YouTube member. My Cave Student tier supporters, Oiku, Earl, Monseville Erno, and my Cave Digger tier supporters, Mauricio Farias and Chang the Dude.